You can share your screen.
All right. Yeah. So you can see my screen, I take it?
Yeah, you're in the great, yep, it needs to go in, yep, there you go.
Okay, very good.
While you're bringing that up, Mike, I just want to do some introductory remarks. Mike is a stream ecologist with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. I really appreciate Mike. He's always been, my whole career with Tudor, he's always been there with us and has helped us at workshops and symposiums and field days and has been a real asset to the program. So I really appreciate Mike and all the things he does for our program. Today he's gonna give us an overview of the environmental risk by Neo. Say it, Mike. Neo.
But easier for you to say it. Neonicotinoids.
Whatever he said. Mike said, yeah. Insecticides posed to aquatic environments. I know what we're talking about, but I don't think I can pronounce it. So.
Sorry.
That's all right. Go ahead. I know it. We still have you in the. We can see all your slides on the left-hand side. So.
All right. I'm kind of struggling to get into the.
Yeah.
How's that?
No. There you go. There you got it.
Okay. Very good.
I only tell you that because it kind of ruins your jokes, if they see them in advance. So, thanks, Mike, for participating, and we appreciate all the things you've done for our program. So, here's Mike Miller.
Very good, thanks, Jeff. I appreciate the opportunity. So obviously we're shifting gears here a little bit from climate change issues and habitat restoration and stocking to perhaps a little bit lower down in the food chain, talking about aquatic invertebrates, kind of big scale things, ecosystem health. Before I start my presentation, I'm going to pose this question here: where have all the insects gone? I think some of you on this call have, over your years of fly fishing in particular, have noticed changes in the emergences or hatches of certain insect species on your favorite streams, whether it's reductions in mayflies or caddisflies or some changes. So what I want to talk about might be relevant to things you may be seeing in your area. Not that long ago, people used to put window screening material on the front of their radiators of their cars or trucks because there's so many insects plugging up the radiators. And, frankly, you don't see much of that, at least I don't see much of that these days on vehicles. And one of the kind of responses to that as well, cars and trucks are much more aerodynamic these days. I don't doubt that for a moment. That's certainly true. My personal experience, though, is that I drive an old Volvo 240, and they're affectionately called Swedish bricks. And so my car is about as aerodynamic as my chest freezer. So when I'm driving to and from the driftless area to go fly fishing, I always make a point of seeing what's kind of insect impacts I've had in my front of my car. And sad to say, it seems like there's not much. So what might be causing that? And I'll offer some potential or a potential hypothesis. So as Jeff mentioned, this issue of these, I'll talk about neonicotinoid insecticides and what that might be doing to our aquatic ecosystems. So there's two things I want to cover in the next 30 minutes or so. One, I'll try to describe what neonics are and then where they're used and how they're used in Wisconsin, in the upper Midwest, and then where do they end up in the environment as far as their environmental occurrence, and then what risks they might pose to our aquatic ecosystems. So what are these chemicals? As you can read here, they're in essence a synthetic version of nicotine that's produced by a number of different plant species. To me, it's kind of curious that this family of plants, the Solanaceae, have very disparate species of plants like tobacco, tomatoes, potatoes, etc. They're often referred to as the deadly nightshade family or the potato family, but each one of these plants and a number of other plants produce neonic compounds, nicotine compounds, and again, the reason for that is that they can repel insect pests. You can see in this photograph, there's aphid, which are insects that in their larval stage are sap feeders, and so they're sucking the sap out of these leaves, and that's a problem with corn and soybean and a number of other crop species. So, how do they work physiologically? Well, they're neurotoxins. You can see or read here that they disrupt the nervous system. A couple of key points I've underlined here is that one, they bind permanently to the neuroreceptors in our bodies and insect bodies and other organisms. But the key, again, word here is permanently. So, for example, mayflies in the stream, they might get exposed to Neonics during a storm event when there's runoff from a crop field. And then there's also kind of chronic background baseline concentration over the course of the year. And again, so it's an additive effect between these episodes of maybe higher concentrations along with the baseline accumulations. So again, this additive effect. Another key thing here is that all the Neonics, and I'll get into this a little bit more in detail later, there's, at least in the upper Midwest, there's 5 different compounds that are primarily used in agriculture and in urban areas. But they all have this similar action on animal life. So again, if 2 or 3 of these compounds are showing up in the water column, we need to think of this as an additive effect because, again, it's not just the effect of compound A versus compound B, but the summation of all of those different chemicals. And I was just on a call last week with some U.S. Geological Survey research scientists that have been studying these chemicals and other pesticides for a decade plus now, and they're thinking, based on some of their studies where they actually dose animals in what they call mesocosms, kind of big aquaria that have an assemblage of insects. In this case, they've been seeing some synergistic effects. So as more information comes out, it may become evident that these chemicals aren't having an additive effect, but also kind of multiplicative effect. So again, some of these laboratory studies we've been gaining some information from are very helpful when we try to relate the concentrations we're seeing in the field with with the responses we're seeing in the laboratory. And then this last bullet here, that the Neonics are less toxic to vertebrates, mammals in particular, so the chemical companies tout that these are very safe insecticides, and that as far as birds and mammals and other vertebrates are concerned, that's quite true, but they're quite toxic to invertebrates, so they're very effective at killing pest species in our crop fields, but they have the same effect on other non-target organisms, whether it's terrestrial insects and adjacent areas next to the crop fields, or again when there's runoff or groundwater delivered to the streams, that these chemicals can have real negative impacts on aquatic invertebrates as well. And one more point is, folks are exposed to nicotine when they're chewing tobacco or smoking cigarettes. The physiological response is you get nervous stimulation, but when it comes to invertebrates, it means paralysis and death. So I just want to touch briefly on kind of their usage and how they may end up in our surface waters. So you can read here the major applications of these insecticides in the environment. Certainly in Wisconsin and the upper Midwest, by far and away the most common use by volume is applying these chemicals to seeds prior to planting. So seed dressing of soybean and corn, again, is the most common use as far as volumes of these chemicals used. But they're also used for foliar spray. So throughout the cropping season, if farmers and producers see insect infestations in their fields, they go out and spray the emergent plants at various stages throughout the cropping season. They're also used in a granulated formulation, so they can be plowed into the furrows in the field, but also folks are doing turf management or treatments in urban areas that apply it as a granulated form. They're used as root drenches for such things as emerald ash borer. So if you see people treating emerald or various tree species that are affected by insects, including ash, you'll oftentimes see them either putting spikes into the tree and introducing these chemicals, or soaking the ground in the kind of root ball area of the tree to take up these chemicals. Then more in urban environments as well, they're used as baits for cockroaches and ants. And lastly, as far as topical uses, they're quite often used in pet flea and tick applications, whether it's in the collars or some of the chemicals you can dab on your pet's fur or whatever. So, a wide array of uses. Again, by quantity or volume, it's primarily an agricultural issue, and it's primarily used for corn and soybeans, but a lot of other grain species, and certainly some more vegetable and fruit crops like potatoes and cranberries. So again, in the state, as you can read here, there's hundreds of compounds that are used that contain neonics. So as far as the use of seed dressing, it's nearly, I wouldn't say impossible, but very difficult to buy corn, seed corn in the state or elsewhere in the upper Midwest that it's not treated with neonics, and also with soybeans. A significant proportion of the soybean seeds that are sold in the U.S. and elsewhere are treated with neonics, and so some farmers may not have the ability to use a non-treated seed even if they wanted to. Now, from an ag producer's perspective, one, if they use treated seeds, they plant the seeds and they can forget about that particular issue of insect pests, deal with other things on the farm or whatever. So they see this as a big benefit that they can, again, use these chemicals on the seeds and hope that that's one less thing they have to worry about. And so ag producers oftentimes see this as a risk reduction effort or kind of an insurance policy where, well, we may not haven't seen any outbreaks of western cutworm or aphids or whatever for the last 5 years, but if it does happen, I could take a definite hit in my production or something, so I'm not going to take that chance. I'm just going to buy the seed that has these chemical applications to them. And the kind of same mentality occurs with things like nitrogen, where many of our fields have sufficient quantities of nitrogen, but farmers feel like, well, it doesn't really cost me that much to apply some more nitrogen, so I'll put some more on as kind of an insurance policy. And so, again, from a ag perspective, perhaps it's not that costly to use these chemicals, but from an environmental perspective, it might be quite costly. So I think we need to kind of revisit some of our thinking in ag economics and incorporate some environmental concerns as well. So again, to a large extent, farmers, ag producers have moved away from these key facets of integrated pest management, and I've listed them here. So this is, I think, very troubling as far as from an environmental perspective, where again we're applying chemicals whether or not they're truly needed at the moment. So again, some of these challenges of for decades farmers are taught to use these integrated pest management techniques, and it seems like we're kind of shifting away from those principles, much to the, I think, frankly, detriment of the environment. So what I'm going to show here is a series of like 4 or 5 slides that show a time series of the use of neonics in the U.S. And this one compound, imidacloprid, is primarily corn insecticide. It's again one of the kind of top 5 that are used in the U.S. And again, it's used on seed coatings, but also the foliar sprays and some of those other applications as well. These neonics first came on the market in 1993. That's when they were first commercially available. And I'll show some data on application rates across the U.S. as over time. And again, if you see kind of cross-hatching in some of these states as far as application rates, it's not because they're not using those chemicals in that county. It's just that the data usage rate data is very difficult to acquire. So if you see some patchiness in these data, it's not because the chemicals are not being used, it's just that it's very difficult to track the usage. So we start out with 1995 and moving into the year 2000, 2005, 2010, 2015. So I think I'm seeing a little bit of a trend here. So again, these chemicals are extremely effective at killing insect pests, but they're also, again, very effective at killing non-target organisms. Interestingly enough, again, within the scientific literature, there's been an exponential increase in the number of studies showing the impacts of these chemicals to aquatic environments, and also due to concerns about these chemicals, there's been a number number of field plot studies testing the effectiveness of these chemicals. Again, they're very toxic, but the bottom line is, are they increasing the crop yields for ag producers? And at least from the recent studies I've looked at, and there's many more available in the scientific literature. Again, this is a pretty wordy slide, and I apologize for that, but you can look at the bolded text here and get an understanding of what I'm trying to, the point I'm trying to make here, that, again, a significant number of studies show that these chemicals seem to be not particularly effective in increasing crop yields. Now, over the last, 175 years, crop yields per acre have trended up fairly dramatically with, different, increased understanding of nutrient application rates, other factors, and as we get kind of more refined in our cropping practices, increases in crop yields have tapered off probably for the last 25 years or so. So again, the point is, we're applying these chemicals to the landscape, but are the farmers truly benefiting? At least some of these studies that I've read suggest not. Now, that does not necessarily hold true for all crop types. Certainly things like potatoes and other vegetable crops that are particularly prone to insect pests, there may be great benefits for some crops, but for, again, the vast majority of the chemical use in the upper Midwest, it appears from most studies I've seen that these neonics are not particularly helpful in helping the farmer's bottom line. And it's always been a challenge with some of these chemical studies that chemical manufacturers, they do their studies and they tell you the effectiveness of the chemicals, but that tends to be proprietary information, so it's very difficult for scientists to look at that data to, make their own interpretation of whether these chemicals are effective or not. So again, we can see information from the chemical producers that seems to be in conflict with what's in this published literature, and I'm not certain if we'll resolve that anytime soon. So how might that be that these chemicals that are extremely toxic to invertebrate life, some don't seem to be all that particularly effective? So I borrowed this illustration from a paper by Martinez and others. So if you look on the left-hand side of that plot, there's that orange color, or reddish color, whatever you want to call that. It shows the concentration of neonics in the seeds and the plants, and how that changes over time. So after some time during the growing season, maybe perhaps a month or something, you can see the concentrations dropping off, the neonic concentration declining very rapidly within the plants. And by the time in the case of soybeans, aphids tend to be a big problem. By the time the aphid populations are most pronounced in mid to late summer, actually more towards late summer, most of those chemicals have been flushed out of the plants. I feel to mention these chemicals are water soluble, so they get distributed throughout the plant. So again, I spoke to one of the authors, who's a professor at Indiana State University, and it was his opinion that perhaps maybe 10% of the corn production in the country could benefit from neonics, particularly in southern states where some of these insect pests become more prominent earlier in the growing season. And another interesting facet of all this is that there's been a few studies I've read that show that some of the natural predators of aphids and other pest species are killed, either their larvae or the adults, like this ladybug beetle, are killed by these chemicals. So crop fields actually lose some of the natural predators that are very effective at killing some of these insect pests. And again, you can see the ladybug ravaging a group of aphids. So this issue, once they leave the crop fields, or do they leave the crop fields, and where do they end up in these environmental compartments, and what might that mean as far as risk to our aquatic resources? So I just wanted to offer some physiochemical properties that are pretty important. One, I mentioned these are systemic toxins that can get distributed throughout the plant because they're water soluble, but that also makes them very highly mobile in the environment. So again, they're planted, the seed-coated plants are planted, or the seeds are planted. Again, that chemicals will wash off fairly quickly after being planted, roughly about a month after planting. Most of those chemicals have washed off and then start moving through the environment, depending on the soil types and depth of the water table and other factors. It also mentioned here that they're pretty long-lived, so again, they have half-lives in the environment, in soil anyway, of upwards of up to 6,000 days or something. So we're seeing accumulations due to repeated applications year after year. So many of you on this call have never heard of Neonics before, but I suspect most, if not all of you, have certainly heard of colony collapse in honeybees. So the text here is showing this LD50. So in laboratory tests of toxicity, the LD50 stands for, that's the lethal dose in which 50% of the test organisms die. And for honeybees, that means a dose of 5 nanograms. So 5 billionths of 1 gram is enough to kill a honeybee. And it's thought that Neonics are 10,000 times more toxic than DDT. So again, they're very toxic to insect pests, but also to a number of other invertebrate species. So just to drive home that point, a single sugar granule weighs roughly, and obviously it varies dramatically, but it weighs somewhere around, a granule weighs 625,000 nanograms. So if we know that 5 nanograms is enough to kill a honeybee, you can do the math here. So just one of those little sugar granules you're seeing in this illustration is enough to kill 125,000 bees. To continue along with that analogy, those packets of sugar you dump into your coffee, they contain somewhere between 3 to 4 grams of sugar. So if you had a comparable amount of Neonics, as you can read here, it's enough to kill 600 million bees. One little sugar packet worth of Neonics. Again, as mentioned earlier, there is 500 products that are registered for use in the state that contain Neonics. And so, how much of this chemical are we applying to the landscape? Well, frankly, we don't really know. I mean, this is data that's not very well tracked by the Department of Agriculture or others that use kind of reporting from ag producers and crop consultants, et cetera, to get some guesstimates on how much of this chemical we're applying to the landscape. So I was kind of curious just to get some ballpark estimates of what that might be. So again, looking at the literature on from the chemical manufacturers, they suggest using a milligram of Neonics per corn seed, and then the typical seeding rates in Wisconsin across the upper Midwest is anywhere between like 25,000 and 40,000 seed kernels per acre of corn. And again, in the state of Wisconsin, we have upwards of nearly 4 million acres of field corn. So my algebra has always been fairly suspect, so feel free to call me if I got my numbers wrong here. But again, based on my crude computation here, just for one crop, again, corn, and it is the dominant crop in this state, but again, it's thought that we apply, or I think we apply somewhere around 128 tons of Neonics annually. So there's a lot of, my guess is there's a lot of sugar granule size quantities of Neonics in 128 tons. So it's kind of it wasn't a very snowy winter in Madison this year, oops, actually this is a photograph taken in June of a Hexagenia mayfly hatch on the Mississippi River. No doubt the fly fishers in the audience have seen these video clips before, but for those that are not familiar with this type of imagery, this shows an emergence of Hexagenia mayflies on the Mississippi River. So again, for those folks that are from the driftless area, you know that kind of center dividing line in between Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois and Iowa is the Mississippi River. So we're seeing an emergence of mayflies on the Mississippi River. Hexagenia mayflies are a burrowing mayfly that live in the bottom sediments of Lake Erie and a lot of lakes across the upper Midwest and some of our larger river systems that have soft sediment. And there's a study done by Stepani and others in 2020. They used weather radar to estimate the emergence quantities of Hexagenia during a single emergence. They estimated there's upwards of 80 billion mayflies hatching in roughly like a 3-hour period at night. And that's thought to be somewhere around 3 tons of biomass. Again, it's a critically important food source for a lot of different animals, not just trout, but spiders, birds, other insects, bats. The list goes on. So if we lose this food source, it's not only an issue for trout streams, but for much of our ecosystems. And part of this Stepani study is, again, they're using weather radar. Based on their recent estimates, they've seen a decline in Hexagenia emergence, not only on the Mississippi River, but in other parts of the upper Midwest, including Western Lake Erie as one example, of upwards of 50%. So they're seeing a major loss of Hexagenia and no doubt other mayfly and other aquatic insect species across the upper Midwest. So I took some data from this study by Morrissey et al. They did some lab studies. They show that somewhere between 35 to 199 parts per trillion is there's a concentration of neonics that are chronically toxic to mayflies, like this Hexagenia in the larvae in the picture here. Concentrations in the water column above 200 parts per trillion is thought to be acutely toxic. And there's another study that showed that at much lower concentrations, you see behavioral shifts in the mayflies where, yeah, it doesn't kill them right away, but in the example with the burrowing mayflies like the Hexagenia, they oftentimes vacate their burrows on the bottom of the Mississippi River or other streams and rivers that they may inhabit. So it may not kill them immediately, but these behavioral changes eventually lead to their death. So I'm gonna, in the next couple of slides, I'm gonna show you some kind of cursory data I collected on and using these threshold values of 35 to 199 and above 200, but it's a very low-ball estimate of potential impacts. So last year I got a grant from the UCP to start sampling streams. I had no idea what I was going to run into as far as whether or not any of these compounds would be detectable or not. So I did some targeted sampling of streams. So it wasn't very systematic, but you can see here from those laboratory thresholds, you can see where we're seeing occurrences of these chemicals and at concentrations that may be chronic or acutely toxic to aquatic invertebrates. And there's some key caveats here. Last year there was a drought year. I think the water rainfall precipitation levels are down about nearly 30%. These samples were collected during base flow, which may not reflect some higher concentrations of neonics found in the water. And I was using filtered samples. I won't get into the details of that, but it allowed me to process samples in the lab at about 1/10 the cost of what it take to just sample or process unfiltered samples. So I have some major caveats to add or offer for this data. So I was kind of reluctant to show that last slide in this one because, again, it's very crude and cursory information, but based on my back-of-the-envelope computations here, my estimate at this point is that upwards of 1,100 streams are probably impacted by neonics either chronically or acutely. Again, if we use that behavioral threshold, that's 1/3 of these chronic and acute concentrations, that number would jump fairly dramatically. So again, this is my first crude cut, and I'm going to be sampling again this year. So here's my study design for 2022. I don't have the resources to sample all the streams, so I'm going to have to use a random subsample. And for that to be unbiased, I need to be careful on how I develop the sampling design. Just to kind of throw some statistical voodoo at you folks, just impress upon you. I think I know what I'm doing here, but we'll be doing a nested population, so we're going to do a subsample of statewide streams and also urban and ag streams, and lastly in areas thought to have high neonic concentrations. And we'll use some other techniques that it's called this grid sampling, gets spatial dispersal of the randomly selected sites. Since there's more small streams than big ones, we use an unequal probability site selection model, and lastly, we'll use a proportions estimate model that you can use relatively small sample populations and come up with very powerful results. So to review again, hopefully now these points will be evident to you that these chemicals are widely used. I think they're used in kind of a poor fashion. Economic benefits of these chemicals are, in my mind, anyway, somewhat suspect. Again, they accumulate on the landscape, they move in the water and enter our streams. And again, we're finding acute and chronic concentrations of neonics in our surface waters. So with that, I'm running a little bit late, but if there's time for questions, I'll try to answer those. Jeff will defer to you on fielding any questions.
Sure, thanks, Mike. Excellent set of slides as usual. I really enjoyed that presentation. I've got one just right off the bat. These neonics, which I appreciate the shortening of the word, but is that something that the farmers apply to the corn, or is that something that the corn comes with.
Right, yeah, so the seed companies apply to it. There's certainly some farmers that pretty, I assume some bigger operations might apply their own, but as I understand it, it's primarily they buy the corn already pre-treated, corn seed pre-treated.
Right, but that gets back to the cost of, you know, of that treated corn versus non-treated corn, and then your study showing that it's really not that economic.
Right.
You know, it just, I'm sure this is the kind of stuff that gets out in the egg papers, but, so I mean, it just seems like an educating of our farmers that, you know, this is not a, this isn't in their best interest financially to do such a thing. I just, I mean, obviously the companies that produce this kind of thing, they've got the money to promote it. Right. But it seems like there should be another group that promotes, you know, how non-effective it is.
Right. So that, frankly, I see that as my mission to educate DNR administrators and legislators and other groups that can affect change. So yeah, amen to everything you just said.
And so is that really something that the state agency can do?
So right now, for example, the state of Wisconsin has a number of lands across the state that they own, but yet farmers still may be cropping on them because of, for whatever reasons, they haven't done the management to restore it back to prairies or whatever. But so the point is, as of like last year, farmers can no longer apply Neonics to these state lands. But again, we need to engage with the Department of Agriculture and, you know, pull together this data that, one, we're seeing toxic effects in the streams, but also, you know, compile all this economic data so we can, you know, offer this very compelling argument. So it's not going to be like the DNR that's going to make the wholesale change here. But again, I think if we inform the public and ag producers and others that, you know, we need to take a closer look at that. My hope is we can affect some change. And frankly, there's been bans in the European Union and Canada and a number of other countries have, in my perspective, seen the light on this, and these chemicals are no longer applied in many very large regions of the planet. So hopefully we'll follow that trend here in the U.S.
Well, that was an excellent presentation, and I'm glad we're able to record these presentations and share them with other groups. I guess I can, we're at 1:30, but I'll just take one quick question here that, so you did testing a number of our chapters and volunteers do testing. It doesn't sound like it's something that the volunteer can typically do, is that correct?
Well, the real hindrance here is just the analytical cost of the samples. Frankly, it's very simple. Just take a water sample with a syringe with a filter on it and squirt it in a bottle and put it in the freezer. So that's very simple. The big heavy lift here is that depending on the analytical technique you use, it can cost upwards of $225 per sample, or the technique I'm using is $25 a sample. So, so yeah, you know, after this year we'll be hopefully a little more intelligent about what we're seeing in the environment. But again, if this is something that Trout Unlimited wants to champion, more than happy to engage with any of the chapters on that sort of discussion. Great.
Well, we're at our time, Mike. I really appreciate it. If you get a chance, if you went into the question and answers, there's a lot of questions that are popping up by your conversation, or your slides stimulated a lot of conversation. If you could help us answer those, I'd appreciate it.
Mission